You ever have that moment when your whole world shatters in a single sentence? When the person you trusted most looks you in the eye and says it's over. This isn't just heartbreak, this is what happens when love turns into a lesson you never asked for. I'm about to share something that changed everything for me. This is Velory Diaries, where every story is real, raw, and unforgettable. Stay till the end because you'll want to hear how this one ends. The dinner table had always been their quiet refuge, a place where laughter once spilled easily between bites and stolen glances meant more than words. But that night, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful or comfortable. It was sharp, cold, and heavy enough to make the air feel thick. The clinking of cutlery against the plate sounded too loud, too deliberate, like an effort to fill the emptiness between them. Every movement felt rehearsed, cautious, as if one wrong word might make the entire evening collapse. The food sat untouched, forgotten, because neither hunger nor appetite could survive in that kind of quiet. It wasn't a fight that caused it. There was no shouting, no tears, no accusations. That almost made it worse. The absence of emotion screamed louder than anger ever could. The silence said everything words didn't. It spoke of distance that had been growing for months, maybe longer. It whispered about conversations that never happened, apologies that were never offered, and love that slowly faded without anyone noticing. The quiet was the sound of two people who had already drifted apart, but hadn't found the courage to admit it yet. Across the table, his eyes told a story that his mouth refused to speak. Once those eyes were filled with warmth, curiosity, and the kind of affection that made everything feel safe. But that night, they were different, hollow, distant, as if he was already somewhere else. He looked at the person sitting across from him, but didn't see them anymore. There was no spark, no recognition, just the dull reflection of someone who had already made up his mind. Guilt lingered there, faint but undeniable. It's like a shadow he couldn't hide. And beneath that guilt, there was something worse: detachment. The kind that comes when love has turned into obligation. The silence between them wasn't just awkward, it was final. It was the pause before the truth, the calm before the confession that would shatter everything. There was an instinctive understanding that something was coming, something that would change the rhythm of their lives forever. Every second stretched painfully long. Every glance felt like a goodbye waiting to be said. And still, no one spoke first. That night wasn't marked by words, but by what wasn't said. The empty seats beside them seemed to echo memories that no longer fit into the present. The laughter that used to fill that space felt like it belonged to strangers now. Even the flickering candlelight, once romantic, now felt like a cruel reminder of what used to be. When he finally looked up, his eyes didn't hold the love they used to carry. They held guilt, quiet, restrained, and final. That look said more than any apology ever could. It was the look of someone who had already left long before the words were spoken. The silence had been the first goodbye. And neither of them realized it until it was too late. He said the words like they were nothing, like he was talking about the weather or making a simple choice. There was no hesitation in his voice, no stumble, no tremor, just calm, practiced certainty. He said he found someone new. The sentence was short, almost gentle, but it hit with a weight that made the world tilt. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was how easily they came out. No trace of guilt strong enough to hold him back, no visible regret that could soften the blow. It sounded rehearsed, as though he'd gone over it in his mind too many times, waiting for the perfect moment to finally say it aloud. The quiet that followed was unbearable. There should have been tears, shouting, maybe even disbelief. But instead, there was only stillness. The kind that comes when something inside you breaks so completely you can't even react. Every heartbeat felt loud enough to echo in the silence. The memories of laughter, warmth, and promises began to flash like a cruel montage, reminding what love had once looked like before it crumbled. There was no big betrayal scene, no dramatic ending, just that one soft, spoken sentence that rewrote everything that had ever been built together. He sat across the table, waiting for a response, maybe bracing for anger or sorrow. But none came. There was no fight left to give. The realization settled in slowly. The person sitting there wasn't the same one who had once promised forever. His voice was familiar, but his soul felt miles away. What hurt most wasn't losing him. It was realizing he had been gone long before this moment. The tears didn't come. Not right away. There was only a numbness. It's like standing outside of your own body, watching something irreversible unfold. The mind tried to catch up with the reality that the love once believed in so deeply had already been replaced. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. Next, it was the end of a version of life that had felt safe. The eyes met for a brief second, and it was impossible to recognize the person staring back. There was no tenderness, no trace of the shared dreams or whispered confessions. The face that once symbolized home now looked like a stranger's. The betrayal didn't come with cruelty. It came with indifference. That was what cut the deepest. The calmness, the quiet certainty, the total lack of hesitation. Still, there was no visible reaction, no begging, no pleading, no scene. Just a long, motionless stare that said everything words couldn't. Love had turned into something hollow, stripped of its meaning. The person sitting there didn't belong to the past anymore. And in that moment, it became clear that crying wouldn't change anything. The love that had been so fiercely protected, so deeply trusted, had already been handed to someone else. All that remained was silence and the quiet acceptance that forever had just ended with 7 simple words. The air felt different that night, colder somehow, even though nothing in the room had changed. The lights were the same, the walls untouched, the faint hum of the heater still filled the silence. Yet there was a chill that came from somewhere deeper. It wasn't the kind of cold that settled on the skin. It was the kind that crept into the heart. Every breath felt heavier, every movement slower, like the weight of what had just been said was pulling everything down. The warmth that once lived in that space, the kind that made a house feel like a home, had disappeared without warning. What replaced it was emptiness, heavy and suffocating. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was final. It didn't need to be filled. It existed as a reminder that something sacred had ended. The room that had seen laughter, arguments, and whispered promises now stood still, like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with everything unspoken, the questions that would never be answered, the explanations that no longer mattered. Even the smallest things seemed to echo with loss. The clinking of a spoon, the soft creak of a chair, the faint hum of the clock ticking away moments that could never be reclaimed. Across that heavy stillness, there was realization. The calmness in his tone earlier hadn't been accidental. It was preparation. He had planned every word, built them carefully so they wouldn't tremble when he finally spoke. Every detail about his confession had been thought through. The timing, the phrasing, even the way he looked away right after saying it, it was all rehearsed. The realization stung deeper than the words themselves. It meant he had been living with this truth long before it was shared. He had practiced breaking a heart while pretending everything was fine. The thought of that made the air even colder. Love wasn't supposed to end this way, not calculated, not planned like a script. It was supposed to be messy, full of emotion and hesitation. But what unfolded was too calm, too measured. There was no trace of struggle in his face, no conflict that hinted at regret. It was as if he had convinced himself that this was the right thing to do, that walking away was easier when the pain had already been numbed. That was when the truth became clear. He hadn't just fallen out of love, he had prepared to leave it behind. The moments of distance, the late nights, the hollow smiles, they had all been part of a slow goodbye. The heartbreak didn't come from his words alone, but from knowing that he had already mourned the relationship in silence while pretending nothing had changed. The warmth that once filled every corner of their world had been replaced by quiet calculation. The air that once carried laughter now held only the faint echo of something that used to be love. Now gone and replaced by the cold comfort of closure he had carefully rehearsed. The letter had been written days before the truth came out, though at the time it wasn't meant to be a reaction to anything. It was written in a moment of unease, an instinct that something was slipping away. Words poured onto paper late at night when the world was quiet, when thoughts felt too heavy to keep inside. It wasn't a love letter in the traditional sense. It was more of a reminder of the memories, the promises, the life that had been built together. It carried the hope that maybe putting everything into words would make things better, that it would bring back the closeness that had started to fade. But deep down, there was already a sense that the letter might one day become something more, a final attempt to be heard. When the moment came, handing over that letter felt like surrender. There were no accusations in it, no bitterness, no anger, just truth. Every word had been written with love that still wanted to be understood even after it had been wounded. There was no way to know how it would be received, but it needed to be given. It wasn't a plea to stay, nor a demand for guilt. It was a reflection of everything that had once mattered. The letter became a mirror, one that forced him to look at what he had chosen to forget. When he took it, there was hesitation. His eyes flickered with something uncertain, maybe confusion or discomfort. He wasn't expecting this. He was expecting tears or an argument, something that would make leaving easier. But instead, there was quiet. He unfolded the paper slowly, his hands trembling slightly, even though he tried to keep them steady. The sound of the paper rustling filled the silence between them, soft but heavy with meaning. As he started to read, his expression began to shift. At first, there was distance, the same detached calmness he had carried all night. But as his eyes moved down the page, that calm started to crack. The words on the paper weren't bitter, they were honest. They reminded him of the first time they met, the laughter they shared, the small moments that used to make everything feel simple and alive. Each line pulled him further into the reality of what he was giving up. His hands trembled more the longer he read. His breathing grew uneven. There was no escape from the truth staring back at him in her handwriting. The letter wasn't written to change his mind. It was written to make him feel. Every memory he had tried to bury resurfaced. Every promise he had broken came alive between the lines. The paper he held wasn't just ink and words. It was the ghost of the love he had once known, speaking louder than any argument ever could. And as he kept reading, that cold certainty he had carried began to fade, replaced by the unmistakable weight of regret. The letter didn't scream or accuse. It didn't demand to be heard through anger or blame. Instead, it spoke softly, in a way that forced the truth to echo louder than shouting ever could. The words were written from a place of remembrance, not revenge. They told the story of two people who once shared everything, their laughter, their fears, their dreams, and how somewhere along the line, they stopped looking in the same direction. Each line peeled back the layers of what had been lost, exposing not just the pain of betrayal, but the quiet sadness of love that had faded without either of them truly noticing. The truth in those words wasn't designed to hurt him, but to make him remember. It reminded him of the nights spent awake, whispering promises about forever. It described the mornings filled with warmth and comfort before silence began to take their place. The letter carried pieces of the past he had tried to erase, the memories he had buried to make space for someone new. It didn't beg him to stay. It simply asked him to look back and recognize the depth of what he was walking away from. There were moments described so vividly that he could almost feel them again. The first time they laughed until their stomachs ached. The way his hand fit perfectly when it reached across the table. The small gestures that once spoke louder than words. Every sentence drew him further into the truth he'd been avoiding. This wasn't anger dressed as poetry. It was love laid bare, fragile and human. The honesty of it stripped away his defenses, leaving him face to face with the reality of his choices. As he read, the confidence he had carried began to falter. The calm, practiced composure started to crumble under the weight of each memory returning to life. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and the ease in his expression slowly disappeared. The guilt that had lingered quietly at the edge of his conscience now stood fully exposed. What once seemed like a clean break began to feel like something much more tragic, a loss he had chosen, not because love had died, but because he had stopped tending to it. By the time he reached the final lines, the room felt different. The air grew heavy with everything unspoken between them. His eyes, once so certain, now flickered with disbelief. He hadn't expected to feel anything. He thought he had already detached himself. But the letter made him see what he had done, not just to another person, but to the version of himself that used to love without hesitation. The change in his face said everything. The guilt that once sat quietly now took shape as realization. What had been an easy decision now looked like a mistake carved in regret. The letter didn't ask him to come back. It didn't need to. It simply reminded him of who he used to be, and that truth alone was powerful enough to make his confidence fall apart. When he reached the last line, His hands stopped trembling and went still. For a moment, there was complete silence. He didn't look up right away. He couldn't. His eyes lingered on the final words, as if reading them again might somehow change what they meant. But they didn't. They stayed the same, unforgiving in their honesty, unyielding in their truth. The room seemed to shrink around him, closing in with the weight of everything he had just remembered, everything he had ignored, and everything he had broken. His throat tightened, and when he finally tried to speak, no sound came out. The voice that had been steady, calm, and confident only minutes earlier now trembled like a fragile thread ready to snap. He tried to form words, an apology, an explanation, anything, but nothing felt right. Every phrase he reached for dissolved before it could leave his mouth. The silence between them returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't cold or detached anymore. It was thick with emotion, with the heaviness of realization. His chest rose and fell unevenly as he fought to hold himself together, but the truth was too much. The calm mask he had worn through the entire conversation was gone. His face showed something raw, regret mixed with disbelief, the kind that comes only when you realize too late that you've destroyed something irreplaceable. The letter had done what words spoken in anger never could. It made him feel. It stripped away his justifications, his self-protection, and forced him to confront what he had become. The silence wasn't just his, it was shared. But now it carried two different meanings. For one, it was the ache of release. For the other, it was the beginning of understanding what had truly been lost. That moment wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no shouts or tears thrown across the room. It was quiet, almost painfully so. The kind of quiet that settles in only after a storm has passed, when the damage is done and all that's left is to see what remains standing. His eyes glistened with the threat of tears he refused to let fall. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to take everything back, but the words never came. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in a long while. What he saw wasn't anger or bitterness. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've said everything that needed to be said, even if it breaks you in the process. That look shattered whatever defenses he had left. Because in that moment, he realized he hadn't just lost a person. He had lost the part of himself that existed only through her love. When he stood to leave, his movements were slower, heavier. The certainty that once guided him was gone. The letter had shown him the truth. He didn't want to face it. He hadn't walked away from love. He had destroyed it. And the silence that followed him out the door was the sound of a heart finally breaking on both sides. Love doesn't end with a single word. It unravels quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize it's gone. What happened that night wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of two people who once believed they could never lose each other. There were no villains, no heroes, only choices and consequences that led them to that moment of silence. Sometimes the hardest truth is knowing that love alone isn't enough to keep someone from leaving. The letter didn't fix anything, but it didn't have to. It wasn't written to change the past. It was written to set the heart free. It gave voice to the pain, the memories, and the unspoken feelings that had been buried under months of quiet distance. It reminded both of them of who they once were before time and neglect built a wall between them. And in that truth, something powerful happened. Not reconciliation, but clarity. When he walked away that night, he carried more than regret. He carried the weight of understanding what he had truly lost. And the one left behind didn't crumble. There was sorrow, yes, but there was also strength. Because surviving heartbreak isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without falling apart. It's about realizing that sometimes closure doesn't come from another person. It comes from the moment you finally stop waiting for them to understand. Every ending has a heartbeat, a final moment that defines everything that came before it. And in this story, it wasn't anger or despair that lingered. It was acceptance, the kind that comes when you finally understand that love can break you, but it can also rebuild you. So when you hear someone say they found someone new, remember, it's not the end of your story. It might just be the beginning of your becoming. And that's what Velory Diaries is all about. Stories that hurt, heal, and remind you that even in the ruins of heartbreak, there's always a way back to yourself. Stay till the end, because every ending here holds a truth worth feeling.